Welcome back. Happy what's today? Tuesday? Happy Tuesday.
Blackout Tuesday.
Blackout Tuesday. Yes, for sure. I got some juices from Sunset Raw. It's owned by an amazing black owned family. It's a black owned
Nice,
family.
nice.
Um,
Owings Mills, Maryland.
Owens Mills, it's amazing. If you like juices or smoothies, check them out. Sunset Raw in Owens Mills. But we're back again.
Welcome back.
We
Happy,
read
what's today,
chapter
Tuesday?
10
Happy
through
Tuesday.
13.
Blackout.
It was some heavy stuff, so we're looking forward to getting into it. I had to read the chapter probably 3 times because I felt like I
Right.
was missing something. But
Right.
we're excited to be here again. Welcome back, Miss Ramona.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back. It's going to be an exciting night tonight. Lots of good topics to talk about, right?
Yeah, that's good stuff. How you feeling?
Feeling great. Eating food again, so I'm feeling really good about myself after the tonsil surgery. So all is well on my end.
You're looking healthy. It looks like you gained a little bit of weight
A
back. So
little
that's
bit back. It's not muscles. It's all bad stuff, but my weight's coming back.
all right. So we're going to start out with our quote. And our quote is from Marcus Garvey. It says, "A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots," by Marcus Garvey.
So true.
So, chapter 10 is titled White.
Yeah.
The quote from chapter 10 says, "Racist ideas suspend reality and retrofit history, including our individual histories." What do you guys think about that?
I think it's true. I honestly, even before that, because I read that on that like the second page of that chapter, I was really confused. I was anxious to know what this chapter was going to be about. This one and the following one, White and Black. And so when I began reading this, and he went back to his days of FAMU and his basically his feelings towards white people, I kind of was confused a little bit throughout the chapter. But one thing that I realized was like there's so much of my history and of our history as America in America that I just didn't know about.
Right.
Just thinking back to what we were taught and what we weren't taught, and how those gaps in our learning really fuel this whole confusion between everybody,
Right.
between white and black people and all people. And so understanding that history is key. And I won't get into my ideas about the rest of the chapter yet, but it just brought back so many different things that I'm like, this is so important that not only white people are reading this book, that we're all reading this book because
Right.
you realize how much you missed and how important that history is in
Right.
making sense of the world today. So
I think we don't really know what we don't know. And I always tell people, when you know, right? So when you kind of bring awareness to things. So he starts out the whole chapter talking about voter suppression. And I noticed, as I was telling you guys earlier in the chat, people were talking about Hamilton. So
yeah,
even looking at that play, Hamilton, and it talks about a little bit about kind of like voter suppression and people trying to kind of like, guide elections, and how allegedly, again, this is their version of the story, how they felt that Alexander Hamilton prevented, you know, Aaron Burr from getting the presidency, right? So we don't know whether or not that's true, but it definitely leads into when people want power, right? Then they do whatever they can to get the power. So we see that even though they had voter suppression, trying to prevent our rights to vote, and when they even gave the right to vote, it really wasn't intended for people of color to vote. It was intended for white males to vote,
mm-hmm.
right? It wasn't for rich white males to vote. It was never intended for even poor people. So even he goes into the fact that people who are poor or white also suffer from some of the policies.
Yeah.
However, with this, what do you guys think about how voter suppression is still kind of a common practice in our society? And even changing some elections. He goes into the Gore election, but we know that it also happened with other elections as well, including the one from 2016.
Yeah.
I think it's important for people to, I'm glad you said current, because it's still happening literally as we speak
Right.
in neighborhoods and towns that some of us live in. And it's all about power. I tell people all the time, there's a reason why, like you hear, it was in Jefferson County in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's a majority African American county, And obviously because of COVID, there are some issues, but there's a primary coming up. And there was one voting site for 600,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, come on. And then you talk about the criminal justice system and laws, which we spoke on a little bit last week. I know the group that I'm with, the Players Coalition, we helped to get a law passed in Florida because, again, if a person committed a crime that was a felony, it takes away their right to vote for life in most cases. They removed that in Florida. Now that was 1.2 or 1.4 million people that are now registered, that are now able to vote. And so we talk about control and trying to eliminate people who may have interest. Well, guess who may be interested in criminal justice reform? The person who may have been incarcerated. Well,
Right.
guess who's impacted by criminal justice reform? The
Absolutely.
Guess who's
Or
impacted?
they say that, right?
Right? Like, it's all about money and control. And you see that when, and that's why it hurts me to my soul when people who don't know the power of their vote, or they feel like their vote don't matter. I was younger, when the Al Gore and Bush election happened. Honestly, I didn't really understand what happened. So that was a great reminder for me, to see and to hear that, because now it's like even more important nowadays in present day like this. So we got to continue to fight this, because this isn't its first rodeo. It's gonna happen again. And with COVID set up, it's probably gonna be even worse this fall. So it's important for us to be aware and figure out what we can do to help.
I also think the narrative
you said.
I was just saying that the narrative, Chanel, we talked about this a little bit about he talks about this, about it wasn't about the hanging chads. So you guys may not remember this, but of course I'm old enough to remember that. And that was the whole narrative. Oh, it's because that they didn't know how to count the votes, even though you had, George Bush's brother was the one that was over, how the recount was going to go. But it wasn't about that. It was about voter suppression. The same with the Stacey Abrams, election down in Georgia. It was about voter suppression. It wasn't about, any kind of anything else. But what they tell you is what we are tend to want to believe. So knowledge is power. So what were you going to say, Chanel?
I was going to say kind of what we said about not understanding the power in the vote. And that kind of goes back to that whole history piece and what we're guilty of, which brought to my attention in the book. We're guilty of shaming those people who don't vote and talking about, how our ancestors fought for this. And we're guilty of the shaming. We're guilty of the shaming. And so, and one thing that he said that really put it into perspective for me was, instead of focusing so much on the people who didn't vote, why are we not having more conversations about the hundreds of thousands of people who did try to vote and couldn't vote, or their ballots were messed up, or whatever the case may be? Right. That would have, been the difference maker in some of these elections. And so I thought that was definitely an eye opener to me, and I had to check myself, because we for sure are the ones like, if you don't vote, blah 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 blah.
And I'm still doing it, by the way. It doesn't change just because Kendi said what he said. Like, no.
I'm right with you, Tori, because I tell people, if you don't vote, regardless of how you vote, then don't complain, and nor will I engage them in a conversation to complain. So the minute they say I'm upset about, and it's about anything that they could have had a vote in, don't talk to me, because I'm like, you have a right to vote. So even now, I tell everybody who's watching today, go out and vote. Whoever you vote for, let your vote be counted, and do not let voter suppression prevent you from using your power, because that's important. So before we move on to the next topic, I'm just gonna give him a quote from the book that in his 1957 speech, Give Us the Ballot, Dr. Martin Luther King said, all types of conniving methods are being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal to the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. And it's crazy to think that over 50 years later, we're having the same conversation and nothing has changed.
Yeah. What did you think about, outside of the voting stuff, what did you think about his idea that white people were the devil, basically?
That's where we're going, right? So that's the next thing he says is, courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to do what is right in the face of it. And then he gets into this whole conversation saying that the only thing wrong with white people is when they embrace racist ideas and policies, and they deny their ideas and policies are racist. And then he goes on to say that if we are racist against white people, then that becomes racism against Black people.
Yeah, that connection. He made that connection. I still think I don't think everyone's fully sold on Black people can be racist. And hearing the whole Malcolm X story and how he changed his mind about it was interesting. But I think a lot of people still hold on to the fact that white people are the ones who are racist and it's a white thing. I kind of am on the side of that's a racist idea to say that white people are just biologically these racist people, these evil people.
Mhm.
That's a racist idea to me. And obviously that's what Kendi argues. But I think there's a lot of people who still think that Black people can't be racist.
Well, because of the whole power dynamic. But if there isn't equity for Black people, then therefore, how can these be racist ideas? Right. So if everybody was given the same opportunities and given what they really needed, we talk about that, right? We talked about, last week about neighborhoods and how people, again, have access to resources. And we talk a little bit about that today. However, if they're not all given the same opportunities to be able to rise in the same way, and we say that we're fighting against this ideal of white power within the United States. And again, not the white person, not an individual person, but
Yeah.
the white ideal that is totally shaped the way that we interact in society. If we say something against that ideal that we want fairness, like Black Lives Matter, then
They
how
think
can we be racist just because we want to have equity?
Yeah, I think a lot of people do that too. They like to say, well, if you're pro-Black, that means you're anti-white, and it's not the case. And so we can't confuse standing up for equality as a thing that we're thinking that Black people are better. No, we just want equality. We want things to be
Right.
fair. And so
Now, what about the argument was being pro-white racist? Like, can you be pro-white?
I mean, you could be whatever you want to be, Tori. However, that's like saying, so people will say, and we talked about this too, Chanel, the other day, right? That if you go out and protest and say you're pro-Black because you want equity, again, not even, I want more than equality. Because if I give you the same $5 and send you out, the person who's who's been oppressed for over 400 years isn't going to have the same opportunity as the person from a more affluent, maybe Bowie, right, in Maryland is not going to have the same opportunity, right? The person from Baltimore is going to have less opportunity than that person from Bowie. So I don't want equal, I want equity. So what
Mhm.
does that person from inner city Baltimore need in order to attain the same things that the person from Bowie needs?
Right.
That's what I need to understand,
But
right?
you can't be pro-white though. If you're pro-white, you're racist.
Well, he says, well, that's true. He says if you're pro-white, you're racist, but he also says, but what they do is they turn that around. When I say they society, because they say if you go out and protest for Black Lives Matter, that means you're anti-white. I don't agree with that. What do you guys think?
I don't agree with that at all. I think when you talk about Black Lives Matter, I mean, we aren't consistently seeing, and I will say this: Black Lives Matter, we have to make sure we're separating it. Like Black Lives Matter, and in this particular movement, is about police brutality. That's it. It's not about all the other issues that we like to bring to the table on it, which could very much make sense when you say Black Lives Matter. But we have to understand this was a rallying cry for police brutality, period.
Mhm.
And so we need to address it as such. And so when you're talking about the things that are happening, we don't see viral videos of, well, I'm not saying white men aren't killed by the police because obviously they are, but we aren't seeing unarmed videos of white men or women being abused and murdered in front of our eyes on film on their cell phones. In fact, I would say we've seen more than enough videos of white individuals who probably deserved to some type of force in order to be handled, but we've seen restraint by and again, I say all of this understanding that it's individual officers who
It
are making
happens,
these
yeah.
decisions, right? Like every officer isn't the same, but consistently and overwhelmingly, it's African Americans who are being abused, and the numbers and statistics show that. So it's important to focus on that. And just because you're focusing on that particular issue doesn't mean you don't care about the white individuals who are being abused by police, but you're drawing attention to what's overwhelmingly happening with African Americans being unarmed and being abused by all.
So let's say that, we're going to say that we're not racist against white people. So if we're not quote unquote hating, and we're that's not us, right? Does that equate to trust of the white ideal? So if they're saying, if I have an idea that I am trying to achieve this success in American society, but I don't trust you because you're always, trying to put in laws into place and put policies into place that are going to oppress me. Because I'm not racist against you, does that mean I have to trust everything that society dishes towards us?
That's tough. I mean, I feel like we try to, and I feel like in the back of our minds, we're not at a place right now where we wholeheartedly trust all white people. I think it's gonna take some time, just like all white people don't trust black people. Like it's gonna that mistrust is a big issue. And that's why we have to have these type of conversations because we're trying to work to bridge those gaps. But there is a lack of trust. Does it make us racist because we don't trust each other? That's where all the prejudice is. Why don't we trust
Right.
each other? You know?
Exactly. It doesn't make us racist if we don't trust. If we see, like, it's the same thing with those microaggressions. So if you
Yeah.
see a black person walking down the street in a more affluent neighborhood and you grab your purse, or that's okay. But if I tell you, if you see a black person walking down the street and they see a police car and they also have a microaggression
Right.
because they're fearful that they're going to get pulled over and potentially killed, how is that, different?
Hmm. It's hard. It's definitely it's a fine line, and I think one of the things we talked about too is this idea that um, when we talk about black people being racist, we struggle with it because the moment we can say black people can be racist too is the moment where some white people use it as a well black people are racist too, like as a kind of like a deflection. And so we don't want everyone leaving here to be like, we understand that there's racism, there's systemic racism, there's systemic racism and all these things, but also black people are racist too. Like we don't need that to be the focus. Like yes, we need to work on all of these working pieces, but the purpose of this is to address why those racist ideas exist. And so it's hard. The back and forth is really hard. That's why these chapters were difficult for me. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was when he said that concentrating on racist white people is distracting us from doing the real work of anti-racism. And that was like the major key. I just made me remember like every day we're posting about, and I'm guilty of this too, posting racist videos of white people doing all these crazy things and tearing down statues and doing all these things. That's an attack on racist white people.
Right.
That's not addressing the racist policies and the racist structures. And so we get focused on that and it kind of distracts us from doing the real work. And so we have to get kind of back to that.
But I still think it's important because if George Floyd's video wasn't released, we wouldn't even be on this stream right now.
Right.
Because it's important for people to become aware. I mean, again, I say all the time, I don't know what was that much different about George Floyd because we've seen so many other videos that have, I felt the exact same way about it. But in terms of that pain, it's like trauma. But honestly, I feel like we become numb to it. It's like you see a video, there's a rallying cry, people act like they care, and then it just goes to the wayside.
Yeah.
And now this time is different, and it's important for us all to look at ourselves in a different way to try to create change.
And it's a time such as this, right? So it was interesting. Before we go on to the next chapter, he kind of ends with this, statement that says white supremacist is a code for anti-human, a nuclear ideology that poses an existential threat to human existence. So even though he spent the whole chapter kind of telling us we should not be racist, but what he points out is that we should really look at what white supremacy stands for. So not to be racist against the people, which we shouldn't be racist against any people. He goes into talking about being anti-Muslim or anti-Asian now with COVID, right? We shouldn't be racist against any particular person, but the concept and ideas that certain races espout, that is what we should look out for.
I thought another thing too, real quickly before we move on to note, is when he talked about equity, like an equitable society would benefit majority of white people way more than the system we live in now. And how we think of this thing as like a white, a white and black thing, but like really a lot of white people don't benefit from the system either. And so we need to start like really just looking at these structures and how an equitable society will help everybody. And so maybe more people will jump on the bandwagon of trying to create one when they realize that, so many more people will benefit from it.
All right, so let's get into the next chapter. Black.
Black.
Black, yes. So the quote is, I thought only white people could be racist. You start to talk about this, right? And that black people could not be racist because black people did not have power. So
Talked about this last week.
we did. We talked about this last week, and he kind of reiterates that, but he gets into the topic of even using the N-word and who's allowed to use the N-word and how we as people of color use the N-word. What do you guys think about his whole conversation around that?
Yeah, I thought this is something that we have this conversation all the time in our household about it, because I've always been along the lines of like, we can use it when we want to, how we want to within our culture, and it's protected in terms of taking power back away from the word. Chanel hates that I think that way. But she's like, we shouldn't use it at all. But this is what I'm saying. The N-word is a word that, if you ask me, should we use it? Is it a word that you absolutely need to use? Does it build you up? No, right? I don't. But what I am saying is there are certain words in multiple cultures that are protected with them. For example, in our LGBTQ community, it's almost safe for them to call each other gay or fag. Words that are very offensive if I, as a straight man, were to say that to them, and very disrespectful if I were to say that.
Or the B word.
Or the B word with women, right? Women can say to each other, I'm not going to say that to Chanel, but it's protected within their culture. Does it make it right? No, but it's understood that it stays within them. So the same way I know I don't need to call a female the B word, or I don't need to call a person who, a homosexual man or woman, anything that's out of their name. I don't understand why it's so hard for white people to realize that they shouldn't say it either. Like, some words are just protected that way, and I get sometimes people have this urge to want to say words that they know.
What about in music?
Are pushing. If you're rapping lyrics to a song, so be it. I mean, like, it's lyrics to a song. Just don't rap those lyrics around me. I'm gonna have an issue with it.
But he goes around, but he talks about, like, if you control a man's mind, you control his actions. And so it's like, we know that word has a long history of being used against us with slavery, to be derogatory, to mess with our heads. But then yet we've embraced it allegedly, right? To say that empowers us, because now we take ownership of it, and it's okay for us to use it for those reasons. But if you use it against us, it still is harmful. Is that an argument that you feel is strong?
Yes.
But the thing is, and Abby just said, so Tori, why can you use the F word? You just said it, but a white person can't use.
I wouldn't call
you wouldn't call somebody that,
no.
But even if a white person said the N word out loud, it would be an issue.
Yeah, and if a straight man calls someone a fag, or if I call somebody a nigga, it should. Or if a white person calls me a nigga, or
but not even calling it, just saying the word, like the word.
Yeah, I shouldn't be saying that to. It's not a word that I should be using like with that culture. Period. It's just, not. And I think it's important to understand that if we really want to make us a whole step forward, I think it would be a great idea to eliminate all of those terms. To be completely honest, within our communities in general, because what may appease one individual may hurt another, right? Literally the same word. And so it's important for us to
But
recognize
it's
that as
important
well.
for us to recognize the difference between nigga and nigger too, because in the book, when we know the difference between someone saying "What's up, my nigga" and using the word nigger, like it's a complete difference, and we know that. But even in the book, and I think we've been guilty of this too, of saying niggas, like when in reference to something negative, like why, or black people. If something goes wrong, we're like, oh, why black people got to act like that? Like we're guilty of saying black people, which is basically saying niggers, basically. And so we
buying into that white ideal mentality, or what, buying into a racist mentality that's been
yeah,
put on us. That's what we're doing, right?
It's your own race.
and we and
Racializing negative behavior the way it would be racialized against us. So we're
we're
contributing to that
doing,
narrative, right?
yeah,
We're contributing to that negative narrative.
and we've definitely witnessed people who try to separate themselves from certain types of black people, the other black people, the ghetto black people. Like we've definitely seen people in higher positions with money or whatever, black people who clearly make it their point to separate themselves from the other black people. And obviously that's an issue.
It is. So the last point for this particular part of the conversation is he goes on to talk about institutional power or systemic power or structural power is the policy making and managing power of people and groups or individuals. So he says power is relative to the space. So do you believe that if we have no power, right, to be racist, because that's the big argument, and I know that a lot of people believe that we can't be racist if we have no power, but we don't have the power to change policies and laws. But if we have any type of power, it's only inherent or relative, or even him saying it's limited. He says the truth is Black people can be racist because Black people do have power, even if limited. So the minute you say it's limited, right? And then he says if we accept the idea that we have no power, we are falling under the sort of mind control that will, in fact, rob us of any power to resist. And
And
it
that's
goes
the
into
powerless defense that he talks
right.
about. That the powerless defense thing for sure stuck out to me. Just the idea that if we believe we have no power, even if we vote, we have no power, even if we try to do better, we have no power, then we'll buy into the racist idea that white people are just more powerful for a reason. And so we have to get out of that mindset. And a lot of people call it victimization. And I've heard white people use that argument that we're always playing the victim. And I think that that victimization mindset is the same thing as the powerless defense that he talks about.
But I think we're starting to see somewhat of a change, or at least people are trying to change it. Like even on this Blackout Tuesday idea, right? I think people are understanding that African Americans like are some of the biggest consumers
Mm-hmm.
in this country. And so people are understanding that there's power in their dollar in terms of trying to impact businesses that way as the way to, hey, we've tried protesting, we tried all these things, like let me see if you can listen this way. And whether it works or not, I have no clue. But it's an educational piece that people are starting to learn that there's power in other ways. So as long as we can stop the narrative that's been in our community for so long,
we've been told that we're nothing.
Like, I know
no
voting,
power.
some of the biggest, I know advocates and some of the biggest people that you guys know right now that are frontline that don't believe in the power of the vote. And I'm like, how are you going to preach any of these other things and you don't vote? Like you're just as much of the problem as you are as to being the solution. Like it just doesn't make any sense. So I think educating each other, the education process happening now for everyone is going to be something that it can benefit us all, especially the African American community, when it comes to understanding what is power,
Right.
or what can you do that is powerful in terms of create action and change.
Yeah, I thought that was, and Karen put in here too, that they separate themselves from the white trash. And so just like within our own races, we're trying to separate ourselves from the others who are not, up to our standard, whatever that standard is. So that was interesting. And then when he talked about black on black crime a little bit.
Oh yes.
And he talked about how we focus so heavily on black crime, and we're not focusing on all the other things that are killing us by the hundreds of thousands with heart diseases and stuff like that, that are ingrained in our community, and that we can't get out of the circumstances. And those structures were built specifically for us to live in those circumstances.
What
And
was
so
interesting about the black on black crime, Chanel, is that the percentages for black on black crime, I want to say it's around in the 90%, 92%, and
yeah,
then white on white crime is around 87%. So it's very close, but people don't say white on white crime. So that's just another example of how we are racialized, our behavior is racialized, but no one talks about that majority of crime on white crime or
mhm,
whatever other race. It's only black on black crime that you hear about. You don't even hear other, people of color like Latinx people. When have you ever heard Latin on Latin crime? Like
yeah.
I've never heard it either, right? And there's a lot of like,
That's
there's a lot, and I work in child welfare, so we have a lot of like Latino gangs, but we've never said that, but
true.
we say it about black people, right? It's the only race that we attribute that to, because again, they're constantly racializing negative behavior towards black people to continue oppressive behaviors to be
Yeah.
accepted.
And even now, because we're having all these talks about police brutality, a lot of people are bringing up, just last week, like a bunch of kids got killed through, senseless violence, and so no one's talking about that, and people fail to realize that, like, there's people fighting for all of this. Just because it's not something that is right now being protested, people are on the front lines every day on the ground doing work to reduce crime and gun violence and all that stuff. And so
every day.
it's so easy to be like, okay, you guys are talking about this, but what about black on black crime? And it's a deflection once again. So
So
I
he
can
said,
speak
go
specifically
ahead,
to
Tori, go ahead.
Baltimore. In Baltimore, I think it's something that bothers me as well because, the media coverage for that isn't going to be the same. Now, obviously, there aren't protests like we're seeing now for that in terms of the masses, but people are doing work and protesting and trying to create change. But nationally, it isn't the same. So it bothers me when people talk about Baltimore, because I know for sure since I've been around, there literally was a movement with the 300 men march where black men were walking and
every Monday,
protesting violence
Right.
there. And actually, one of the black men that was marching and leading this is going to be the next mayor of Baltimore, and Brandon Scott, before he made it to where he was a councilman, and now he's going to be the mayor here soon. But and every Monday, Thursday, Friday, it's going to be end up being 7 days a week. There are men in Baltimore walking the streets, giving people on the corner resources, trying to stop violence. So there are things that are happening. That's only what I know there. So when people talk, well, what about Chicago? Obviously, the numbers of shootings are very alarming.
Mhm.
But I know there are people there that are trying to work to create change there as well. But
and
it's
not
not
only
gonna
that, the people, when those people are caught, they get locked up. They go to
right.
jail. There's consequences. The issue with police brutality is people aren't seeing the consequences that they deserve, and so that is a big deflection. It's back and forth, but it's always a topic of conversation anytime these things are brought up.
So the last thing, and I'm glad you brought up police because we talked about this a little bit. He says to color police racism is white on the pretext that only white people can be racist is to ignore the non-white officer's history and profiling of killing, quote unquote, them niggers,
Mm.
right? He says white officers are far more likely to be racist than black officers these days. So is it that white officers are more racist, or are we racist against our own people when we're police officers?
I think it's
It's
both.
both. Yeah.
I think it's both. I mean, since we're talking about Baltimore, I mean, Freddie Gray, I don't think there was one white officer there, that was involved in his death. So it's the policing culture
Yeah.
in general, the negative policing culture and how people are treated or how they're judged based on their own bias. Because just because you're black doesn't mean you don't judge people with your own bias the same way, right? Like I think that sometimes people confuse that, but it's like I said, it's different when a person has power
Yeah.
in that situation to dictate and control the environment. So I think that's something that we often skip over with our own
Yeah.
bias because there are black officers who are a problem as well, but it isn't happening at the same rate as it is with white officers. But with the whole issue is no one's asking for white officer reform.
Right.
It's
You're right. You're
police
right.
reform.
But what's interesting is that, and I think we talked about this a little bit, is that when you have black officers, and my son-in-law's brother is a LAPD officer, And he was saying that even when he tries to report white officers for inappropriate behavior, that there's this kind of like internal code that people are trying to protect the law enforcement agency itself. So we had a very, and I think if you guys watched Dave Chappelle's 846, he talks about the very famous situation we had here with Christopher Dorner.
Mhm.
What happened with this young man is he tried to report something and said that his partner was being, using excessive force. They end up blackballing him, firing him, and this dude was like a sniper, like with the military, special forces, and he came at him. And I remember when that happened because I was working at a Rampart division at the time for LA, which is one of our famous stations here in Los Angeles. And I was working there, and I remember every single moment them chasing him up into the mountains and literally burning him to death because he ended up killing quite a few people, including some police officers, all because they didn't listen to him. And he tried to go through the proper channels. So it's almost like that they have this again. You control the mind, you control the actions. So if you join this Blue Lives Club, and someone pointed out,
Yeah.
I read somewhere on one of the social media sites that there is no such thing as a blue life. That's not a race. That's an organization. Because that would be the same thing as saying the Ku Klux Klan are the white, right? That's the white race, and it isn't. So do we say, and I'm all for protecting police officers in regards to, I don't feel that they should be killed, but they also feel they shouldn't be killing us. So what do you guys think about that whole code?
I think the it's ironic to me that police officers' job is to try to get people to cooperate and AKA snitch, depending on what you want to call it, and they don't even tell on their own officers on a consistent basis, or they're judged from it. And it really bothers me because when I feel like when you're in a position of power, you're held to a higher standard. But I understand why it happens because every family, every organization, every culture tries to protect their own.
Yeah.
Well, when you're in the position of being the individual that's supposed to protect and serve, you can't do that, right? If you're a leader of a government agency, you can't do that. Like you're held to a higher standard. So there's no one that polices the police, and that's the issue that we have. There's not enough overwatch, so things are just happening, and no one's telling and no one's talking. Well, each and every day they go out and they're upset that people aren't talking to them about things to solve things. So
Right.
until the blue code changes and they stop protecting each other and they just do what's right, which is what a lot of officers sign up for, but some of the best officers aren't even comfortable telling on their partners. Until that changes, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is just honestly talk. And unless we figure out legislative ways to make sure they're punished and unions and their unions don't have as much power, but that's a whole another conversation. I'll pass it over. Yeah.
Well, we're at 5:11, so we're going to move on. And thank you guys for that very robust conversation on black and white. But we're going to continue that as we get into the chapter on class. So we get into that. And our quote is, whoever creates the norm creates the hierarchy and positions their own race class at the top of the hierarchy. So we get into class and capitalism and all of these things. So uh, it says class racism is the intersection of classes, elitists versus the poor, and races, blacks versus whites. Policies are the problem, not the people. What do you guys think?
I mean, that's his whole basis for the whole book. Policies are the problem, not people. But again, those hierarchies keep coming back into place. Um, the elitist versus the poor. And we always have these conversations where people are like, that's not a racist thing, that's a class problem. And Kendi does a good job of really explaining how they're twins, they're intersected. And that you can't really understand without one without the other. And I know we got into the debate, Ramona, about whether capitalism leads to racism or equals racism. And you had what were your thoughts on that?
So we have a poll, and I hopefully we can put the poll into the chat right now because I'm really interested into what people thought about it before we get into what we think about it. But definitely, we're going to get into whether or not we think capitalism is racism. So, what do you guys think in the chat? If you guys could just answer that, we're going to talk about that in about a couple of minutes. So we're going to touch upon a couple of other topics so we can find out what our audience thinks before we actually tell them what we think, because we don't want to like color their ideas, right? He goes into the construct of ghetto blacks and white trash, which we talked about a little bit, as the most obvious ideological forms of class racism, how we put people in like this system of who's lesser than, who's better than, or even us, when we say we don't want to live in that neighborhood, we don't want our kids dating those people because they come from certain areas. So
Yeah.
how does that tie into, before we get into the discussion of capitalism, how does that tie into how people think in regards to that binary of you're either good or you're bad?
I think we do that more than we realize it, like subconsciously. Um, there's the binary, like you said, in light versus dark, rich versus poor, white versus black, like anti-racist, racist. Like
Yeah, that's the
there's
thing.
no middle ground, and it's really hard to place yourself to think about how you view those things. Because I think for me, I realize that I am flawed in so many of the thinking that I have, so many of my thoughts. But when it comes to class, I for sure, I'm in my area. I grew up in this really small town, Conshohocken, and on my 2 blocks was like wasn't the rich part of town. And so Conshohocken Elementary School was the school we went to, and the well-off kids went to like White Marsh and the other schools. But within our town, we had people who were considered the white trash, and then you had the poor blacks. And so we kind of had lived the same experience. We grew up living the same experiences. But one thing I definitely realized after, especially after reading the book, there white people definitely thought like we're poor, but we're not black, so we're good. And so that was interesting to me that even poor white people who live similar experiences to us still realize that, but it could be even worse. We could be black and poor. And so
Right.
that's like the worst of the worst. And the poor black people get treated a very particular way in the school system and everywhere they go.
Everything.
Right. We talked about this earlier about how people struggle financially, but take, again, consolation in the fact that they're not, like you just said, right? So let's see where we're at. He says we have, okay, somewhat. All right. So we have about 48 people saying somewhat, some saying yes, and some people saying no. So we're going to get into our conversation about capitalism. So do you want me to tell you what I think, or do you want me to
Yes,
say
tell us.
I see. So I'll say that when we first looked at it, I thought there's no way, like, well, not that there's no way that capitalism can't be racist, because I do think our society is set up to have that 1% to have the wealth in the country. But I also think it's set up to give people an opportunity to better themselves. And I
Mhm.
like that about capitalism, but I also think that there's kind of, a liberal side of capitalism, and the Democratic Party somewhat is that way, where they're a little bit looser in regards of we want to help people, but not in a definitely far left socialist way. We want to give people opportunities. And
Yeah.
then when I was researching it, I come upon a quote by Malcolm X that says, "You can't have racism without capitalism." And as I think I told you guys,
That's right.
I'm a big Malcolm X fan, and I said, "Oh my goodness!" So I had to read up all this information about capitalism, and I had to agree with them that based on the ideologies and the way it was set up, our system was set up, and I think I even shared with you that even looking at our money, it has all these racist images on it, and that's what we aspire to, is to look towards that money, which is really the white ideal. So, what do you guys think about capitalism?
I mean, it's 100% designed that way. Like, I'm looking at Matthew Dale, and he's over here preaching in the chat. Capitalism must have winners and losers, and to me, that stands out like no other. I'm a person that benefited from a capitalist environment, having the opportunity to move up from the bottom because of opportunity. But the reality of it is, I'm an outlier.
Right,
Capitalism always favors the people who are starting out in front with capital. Well, who in this country has consistently been out in front and who consistently has capital or resources, depending on what you want
right,
to use as your asset to move forward. And so understanding that, to me, like it's very clear that we all understand at this point, if you're not, you've been reading with your eyes closed, that it was built and designed this way. But understanding that there's always going to be a separate body, and it lifts the floor, right? So like even if you have the opportunity to move up, like yes, I had the opportunity to rise, but there's always going to be people who are going to be left at the bottom. It's not because they don't have the talent,
Right.
It's because they don't have the opportunity or the resources to move forward. So that to me is the part that I struggle with when it comes to strictly a capitalist environment. And I'm saying that because I have a debate that's playing in my head right now.
I'm about to
from
say,
the
you had
locker
these
room.
debates
I
every
was
day.
had these debates all the time in the locker room with some great guys. And to me, it always sounds good when you're starting forward. But let's talk specifically about government assistance, which is always
That's a
something
big
which is
conversation.
always the biggest part of any conversation when you're talking about money and helping people. Is government assistance. So most people who are more conservative and really believe in a capitalist environment, it believes that the government needs to get their hands out the way, they need to move, and all the money needs to go in. Well, how can you convince an individual who is already struggling with government assistance to pay the bills and to eat? And I like to say that the worst person to be is a person that's working and that's right above the line, the poverty line, where you
the working poor, what they
don't
call
get
blue
help.
collar, right?
Yes, though that is the worst place to be in this country because you're struggling by working hard, but in a capitalist environment, it tells you that you can work and move up and have a better opportunity. But the reality of it is, we know that everyone in every job isn't the same.
Yeah. Oh, and
And
you're punished for moving up, right?
Right.
You're punished for moving up. So even as I was saying earlier, like if you have a disability in this country, you can't have even $2,000. Yeah, the $2,000 is the cap to have in your bank account, and that's any disability. If you have cancer, if you have, some kind of mental health condition, but you want to better yourself, right? You want to do something different. If you have, a physical disability in this country, then you want to get medical services. The government says, we'll give you that. But if you have over this cap, then you don't qualify for those services. So it tells you need to stay poor and really not better yourself. So now I'm going to be poor with a disability, or either I'm going to have money to take care of it myself, or I'm going to not have anything and stay in this poor thing. And so it's like the access to resources, they're scarce in low income Black communities, even in comparison to low income white communities, because the ideal is to always keep people oppressed. As we said, we gave you this freedom, but are you truly free? So how does that work in a capitalistic society?
Yeah, and I think people a lot of times will, just what you said, will use that argument that the more we provide, support and services for people, that people aren't going to try to do better for themselves. And I think they have, in my mind, they have this picture of the Black person, the Black single mom who's just feeding off of the system and is not working, not trying to work, not trying to better her family. And I think people get that twisted a lot. There's a lot of really hard working people who literally need that money or that help with groceries, like the basic necessities, working two jobs. We know family members personally who are working their butts off and still struggle to pay for rent, still struggle to give their kids what they need. And so you take those things from people. Will people figure it out? They'll figure it out, but it's going to be really, really tough. And I think those disparities will keep being greater and greater.
Another thing it's kind of off topic, but the concept of family, we were talking about it off camera, how like certain benefits, if you are married, like you lose them because now you're overqualified. So
you're punished.
In my opinion, I think that highlights why you see a lot of the numbers in impoverished communities like, oh, a father isn't around. Well, news to you, that father may be around, but they aren't incentivized to be married because they're going to struggle either way. So you might as well have help. And so that's not the case for everyone, because I know for sure with my mother, she worked her tail off. We were on government assistance and we weren't always on it. And we lived above that. What's the title called?
Pink collar.
The
federal poverty line? You talking about the federal poverty line?
Right. We were above it. She's working two jobs and we're barely making it, and she's barely sleeping. So like it's everyone's, and we associate, and I feel like it's only in minority communities, because I've never once heard anyone talk bad about the white Americans that are using public
Yeah.
assistance. Like I
But
just
you know that
government
majority of public assistance is, white people.
right,
I
and
can
but
tell
it's
you that because I
never
worked for the
I've
welfare
never
service. Yeah.
once heard it like thrown like it's punished or in a negative
Right.
way. Like I feel like it's always talked about, and you know, it may be an exaggeration, but it's the truth in my experience is that
Yeah.
when it's talked about in a negative way. And I feel like the picture and the face that people have of an individual that's on government assistance
Yeah.
is an inner city individual that's Black.
Indigent poor Black person. Absolutely. So we're going to move on to our last topic of the day, into spaces. And thank you guys. I don't want to, cut off that conversation because we probably could be talking all night about that. However, the next slide says when we unchain ourselves from the space racism that deracializes and normalizes and elevates elite white spaces while doing the opposite to Black spaces, we will find good and bad, again to the binary, violence and nonviolence in all spaces, no matter how poor or rich, Black or non Black, which is a really good way to kind of end the discussion today because he talks about basically if you're looking for, negative things, you're going to find them in both white spaces and Black spaces. But what's racialized are the ones in Black spaces. And then he goes on to say, he argues that as many ways as there to see the world, but it's mainly seen again from that white center, right? From that white ideal. And that when white enters, and not white people per se, but just the ideal of white enters a space, it becomes a white space. And then also, I'll give you the example that recently, with regards to gentrification around Howard University in DC, and you guys don't live too far from there, there was a lot of gentrification in the neighborhood surrounding the university. And if you guys don't know, it's a historical Black university in Washington, DC. And so white individuals were walking their dogs and leaving their dogs, poop all over the university, and were getting upset that people were telling them, oh my gosh, like, so you can't do that. Or I was telling you, Chanel, if you go into a salon, everyone else is just chilling, and then a person will come in and expect this privilege because they're white. So what do you guys think about that?
I think I've definitely had those experiences. Now after reading the book, I'm trying not to, like you said, when certain white people come in, they, have this privilege or they carry this expectation. I've seen it hands on so many times, just like even at the store. I watch how people treat people, like different workers who are Black or who are Latino or whatever. And I've definitely sensed that sense of entitlement to be treated a certain way. But after reading this book, I have to really train my mind not to see it as a white person thing and to see it as a individual who is acting that way. And like he said, if you look hard enough, you're going to find lazy people, both Black and white. You're going to find violent people, both Black and white. You're going to find it, but for some reason, those negative behaviors get pinned as a Black thing.
It's a mental model, right? He gets into the fact about, he gets it, and Tori, you can respond to this because he talks about how we aspire as African Americans to move into white neighborhoods, but they're home to white collar crimes, right? That are more damaging than even Black crimes, right? And then he says that racist Americans stigmatize entire Black neighborhoods as places of homicide and mortal violence, but don't similarly connect white neighborhoods to disproportionate number of white males who are engaging in mass shootings. So it's on equal treatment of white crimes and Black crimes, resulting in death to Black lives. So if we constantly look at only the Black crimes, this is why we're seen as more dangerous, going back to how the Black body is seen. And all this really comes down to, even in our spaces, they're racialized as well. What do you guys think about that?
I think one of the big things to talk about too is, you mentioned this earlier, is the opportunity gap versus the achievement gap. And
right.
We like to believe like people in these impoverished neighborhoods, they're just not working hard enough, or they're not smart enough. They don't have, their culture is just jacked up and needs to change. When really a lot of these spaces, he calls them, they don't have the equal opportunity. They don't have equal resources. And like he said, where there's high, when people don't have jobs, then there's going to be more crime. And of course, in our areas, in those Black spaces, you're going to see more of the violence because of the opportunity gap. There's no opportunities. And so if you lack resources, we go to Baltimore City so often. All you have to do is drive there to see. You can drive there and you can have one lens on and you can say, these are a bunch of lazy people, violent, dangerous, they're horrible people. Or you can look around and see and go to these schools and be like, wow, like this is the school they're expected to do so well in. These are the streets the kids have to walk on to get to school every day. These are the stores, liquor stores, and no healthy restaurants that are in the neighborhood. Yeah, you can look at those things and you can hopefully change your perspective on why people in those areas, come out the way they do. It's not a Black thing. It's the opportunities that are lacking in those areas where Black people live.
And the thing that people often throw out there is that, oh, it's their parents. Well, do you understand the cycle that they've been in?
Right.
And if, let's say it is the parents' fault, right? What about the kids? So do you just let them go for a free fall because of the environment that they're in? No, you try to improve and make sure that they have those resources. I promise you, if you go into these schools, for every kid that may catch your attention because they stand out or they may be a bad kid, there's plenty of stars in these schools as well that would shine in those environments that you want to send your schools to. I tell people all the time, in Baltimore, it's the weirdest thing in Baltimore and really in Maryland in general, where if you ask someone where they went to school, they aren't going to say UCLA, Maryland, whatever. They're going to say their high school. And it's because they have so many private schools that they're really proud of. And there's some great schools that people are proud of, Poly City, Dunbar, right? But the reality of it is they do that because it's like a stamp of, look where I went to, look what I accomplished. I made it to this career.
Right.
And when it comes to city schools, right? People work in these city schools, in the city schools or for the city, and don't send their kids to the public city school. I mean, I think that tells you everything that you know. Like there's a problem that we need to collectively fix because we're just leaving the kids out to dry. And when we have resources, and I'm just as guilty as anyone else, I didn't move back to the neighborhood. We moved out to a county. One, I like land, so I would never live in the city anyway. But we moved into an area where we know our kids are going to have great schools, but our kids are no better than any kid in any inner city school, which is another term that gets on my nerves when you talk about inner city, because you never talk about inner city in a way that's positive. It's always where the crime exists, where the bad schools are, where the bad people are, which we've learned more often than not.
Mm-hmm. So the last question I'll ask you, because we're at the hour mark, but I know we started a few minutes late, is I really want you guys to respond your final thoughts on the difference between HBCUs and HWCUs, or historical white versus historical Black universities, and how they produce different types of success. And then also the access to resources. So Chanel, I know you're an educator. So just thinking about it, why do we have to, again, we talked about this, right? Send our kids to a different school, and the importance of Black students having Black teachers and being shown Black excellence. So just think about those two things. Give your final thoughts before we do the final quote.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when was it in the book or did you tell me the statistics about, I think it was in the book, that people who attend HBCUs have better.
Yes, they have better outcomes. Right, they have better outcomes.
I thought that was so eye-opening because I've had one Black teacher. I had one Black teacher in high school, never in elementary school. But there is something in representation. And I was talking to Tori about it. Why aren't there more Black teachers? Is it a field that we're not going into? Is it a hiring thing? I was like, I need to do that research, because looking back in my school, there were about 6 of us who were in our cohort, 6 Black people who were in the cohort. It's overwhelmingly white females to that degree. But why is there a gap in that? And we know for sure, I know in my school, the kids fought to be in my class. Like they wanted to be in my class. And I was young too, so it might have been because I was young, but just seeing themselves, they needed to be in my class, especially the struggling students. There was some type of connection that they felt with me that they just had to be in my class. But I was wondering, I was talking to Tori about it, why is there a gap in in teaching? Why is there such a disparity in Black teachers versus white teachers?
We were trying to figure that out. And the one thing I think we've talked about too before we end is that racism still is running rampant when it comes to white teachers. I think I was sharing with you that a colleague was doing some research around racism in primary school. And this happened just 2 weeks ago. So she says that she's white and she went to the school because the teacher called her for a parent teacher conference to tell her that her son was making the wrong kind of friends. So she was worried and she says, "What do you mean the wrong kind of friends?" And then she proceeds to point out the 3 Black students in the class. Not that they were, had behavior issues. So then she was so upset about it. She goes to the principal and superintendent to talk about this, and nothing was really done. So that is currently going on in our society, where you still have these enclaves of racist individuals that are teaching our kids. Or like he even says in the book, how he was in the back of the class and had to stand up for that girl. I think that was last week, right? Because she was like, oh my gosh, wanting to raise her hand and she was never called upon. So do we want our children to be bused into these better schools, or do we want the resources, like you were saying about districting, to be put into the schools where our kids are?
I think that is the key. And Karen is talking about that same thing right now. It's not that these schools can't thrive. We need to pour more into those schools. The teachers are overwhelmed because they're dealing with so much more. Some of the kids are coming to schools without basic needs being met. And so when you have that, and then you have overcrowded classrooms, you have all these things, it's not that the school itself is a problem or the teachers are a problem or the kids are a problem.
No, in some cases in some city schools, like the teachers are a problem. Absolutely.
In some schools for sure. But
like some of them don't even have to have full degrees to be like, people don't sign up and want to go there, whether it's
I know when I graduated, there was 3 of us who even applied for Baltimore City. Everyone went to Howard County and to Montgomery County, which was interesting. But like you said, yeah, it's not that these schools are a problem. The schools aren't the problem. The kids aren't a problem. Is that we need to pour more into them so that they can be successful and flourish.
All right, you guys. Well, next week's going to be the last week. So this is the end quote for today. When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcome. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. Audre Lorde. So speak up and speak out and call out racism. Chanel, did you want to do the reflections or do you want me to do them?
You can do them because our computer is being slow.
All right. So reflections for you guys to look at this week is number 1. If your goal is to live and function as an anti-racist, do you internally have the courage to do what is right in the face of fear? Because sometimes it's hard, again, to be able to step out of your comfort zone and talk about those things. Number 2, think about ways in which you regularly center whiteness, your interest, and your comfort. And 3, what steps will you need to take to move society from the dueling consciousness of anti-racism and assimilation to ideal single consciousness of anti-racism?
Yeah. Can I share one more story before we leave?
You can.
So it's freezing in this room and I can't focus. I wanted to get up and get a jacket, but I didn't want to be unprofessional, but I'm freezing. When I was a student teacher, I taught in a school, which there was 3 of us who taught in the school, the same 3 people who applied for city schools to teach in city schools. They put us in a school that was new, that wasn't, the ideal school. And they chose us for this school. And I remember my student teacher, he was explaining to me, how the kids act and whatever. He clearly had his thoughts about this group of kids. It was predominantly Black and Latino, but the kids were singing the song Jerk. Have you heard the song You're a Jerk? It's a song called You're a Jerk. And so the kids were literally singing this song and he spazzes out at them, sends them all to the principal's office because they were calling each other jerks. And I explained to him, and I was like, I think they're singing a song. And he was like, no, they're calling each other jerks. This is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. Kicked them out of class. So they were out of class for 45 minutes because they were singing the song Jerk. And it's just simple things like that we have to learn about the kids, really pay attention to their legs. It would have been a very quick conversation for him to say, what are you guys talking about? And they would have said we were singing the song, and that would have been it. But we're so quick to judge these kids and to kick them out. And so we do need teachers who are equipped, and the college experience doesn't teach you how to prepare for these schools. I promise you. Like my whole college education, I didn't use half of that when I entered the classroom. And so we have to do better with training so that teachers are equipped with, working with students in different settings. So
Right. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. Next week is our last week. We're going to be finishing up the book. Final words, you two?
Final words.
I said the final word twice.
To me, continue the journey.
Keep working.
Kendi, this is an amazing book, but it's only a resource. It's not perfect. It's meant to challenge you in your thinking and to help you grow, so that you're confident speaking up, that you're confident sharing what you know. Mm-hmm. Because I know, even for myself, I feel like I've always been comfortable in this space, and not even from a straight up knowledge perspective, just simply from living it. But when you go and you read things that make you challenge even your own views, you realize, you have your major flaws and things that you can improve on, and things that, I feel an obligation to share to help others. So make sure that you are here for the finale, and
next week,
that you're doing your part to continue to change the narrative for everyone, so that, we can all grow and be better during these times. And wear your mask.
Yes, please. Bye, guys.
See ya.